Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm going to be talking today about building and editing in the 3D workspace. As you can see, the Maestro 11 layout puts the styling and building tools together at the top of the screen in the area that's generally called the selection toolbar. So you can just familiarize yourself with the layout if you haven't been attending the rest of these webinars. If you have been, I'm sure it's all quite familiar. So I will be sharing my Maestro build. We have a lot to cover today, so I'm going to jump right in. Let me see how to share. I'll just have to think about this again. There we go. Okay. I hope everyone's seeing my screen. The build tools are a small palette of building, and it's up at the top of the screen. If you click it, you'll see this little floating window. And unlike the style toolbox, this is actually a real floating window that you can move to a place where it's convenient for you. And it stays open as you make selections because, in fact, it requires selection to operate. So if you want to close it, you can either click the build button again, and when you open it, it will remember where you last placed it, so you don't have to keep replacing it. And there will also be some kind of windowing controls at the top, so you can close it here. If this is a Mac, you'll have a different location on your other operating systems. One thing to keep in mind is that if you if you've placed the builder like very far away and you lose track of where you placed it, you can double click the build button and it'll jump back up to the top. Now, as with most of the other functionality in Maestro 11, the builder is organized in groupings of functionality. And so we're going to start with these 4 buttons that obviously look alike. They're all ways to create a new entry, because part of the builder is often either creating a new empty entry to start building a new structure in, or you may want to duplicate an existing entry so that you have a backup and so on. So the first button lets you create an empty entry, and you see a banner comes up with the default name, which you can edit, and you can check mark if you want to change the name or just accept the name, and the X just closes it and keeps the name. You'll see the entry has been added here, and it is empty. Now, if you instead want to start working from an existing entry, we advise you, as best practice, to make a copy of the entry before you start working in it. So the quick way to do that is the second button is the duplicate entry button, and it works no matter how many entries you have in your workspace. It will duplicate all of them. So here I have just one, and it uses the name and adds an underscore copy by default, but you can edit this to say _2, and now you have a new entry called _2. If you had multiple entries, just to let you know, if you had multiple entries in your workspace and you did the duplicate, it would say that you've created 2 duplicates, and it would just give you the suffix that you could modify. And you can see it already created those, so you don't have to do anything except close the banner. Okay. So now that you have a duplicate, so I'm using the duplicate here, you can also, I should point out, you may not have wanted to duplicate the entire entry. You may have just wanted to duplicate the ligand. And that's the third button. As you can see, it's disabled because nothing's selected. Both of these 2 buttons operate on selected entries. So let's select the ligand. And now this button copies the ligand into a new entry. So if you just want to work on the entry, on the ligand, you can do that here. And I'm going to call this 1FJS _ ligand. And that last button is, suppose you want to work on the ligand in isolation from the protein receptor. And so there's a quick way to do that as well. You can select the ligand and click that last button, which is extract the selected items from the entry or entries. So if you had selected items from multiple entries, you could pull them out of their current entries into a new entry. And so I'm going to do that now. So it looks the same. We'll call this just ligand for now. It looks the same as last time, but if you go back to the original entry, you'll see it actually no longer has its ligand. This is useful if you want to be able to simultaneously work with them together or individually. And the other thing that's useful for is that you can lock your protein in this case so that it's not editable. And when you do that, you can even select it. So if you are working with a ligand, you don't have to worry about accidentally selecting protein atoms. So those are those first 4 buttons. They all have to do with creating new entries. The next button is the 2D sketcher, and that's most useful when you want to work in 2D to edit a small molecule or to create a new molecule from scratch. If you have a complex in the workspace, that button will actually open the ligand interaction diagram. But don't get too attached to that button because we may be taking it away in future versions. The next button on this list, I'm going to only, on this row, I'm going to only go through a little quickly because it's the advanced editing functionality, and I could spend all day on that alone, but I will give you an example. So right now, if you open this up, it looks like there's nothing there because all of these act on selection. So you have to have selected something. And in fact, what you've selected will affect what you see in this menu. So now I can choose to invert chirality, etc. I will give you some examples if we can get this a nice picture so you can see it. All right, let's see if that's clean enough. So if I invert chirality, it just swung the structure over to the left, and you can see the R, it's a stereoisomer R. And if you invert it again, it goes back and it says S. If you want to convert cis and trans here, it will move this portion of the structure. If you want to select a different rotamer, if this residue is in our residue library, we have rotamers stored up for it. You can actually just step through the different rotamers in the library and get information about them. And you can find the lowest energy one by clicking the star or reset to the original. And if you click the I, you'll actually go into our old rotamers dialog, for those of you who are familiar with classic Maestro. So I'll just cancel out of here for now. As you can see, I'm going through these quickly. There's options to change the isotope. Those depend on selection having to be the same element. So here I have 2 carbon selected, so you can actually change both of them at the same time. Mutate residue is fun. Right now we have a glutamic acid, I believe. Let's see what this is. Yes. So if you want to change it to a glycine, you can just click there, and you've changed it to a glycine or a glutamine, and put it back to a glutamic acid. And these other features are more advanced for when you're building and you want to reset all your protein residue numbers, or if you want to change a residue name or chain name or change the partial occupancies. That's all in here. Okay. Now this next set of buttons, they're all along this row, are what I call the basic editing functions. And for that, I'm going to go into a more basic structure. It's my ligand, but it's shown in a cleaner way. And as you can see, they're all disabled because they all work on selection. So obviously, what you would do is select whatever atoms you want to operate on and click the appropriate button. So here we have delete, and that deletes all the atoms. And undo is up here under edit. You can undo that delete, and Control Z works, or Command Z if you're on a Mac. So I deleted all those atoms. If I wanted to delete just a bond, we now have a new feature that lets me delete just a bond without worrying about accidentally deleting the atoms, and that's this button here, Delete Bond. And that will actually work on more than one bond at a time. And then there's Add Bond, which lets you reconnect structures or connect structures just like that. And this button only, as you can see, it's already disabled because there is a bond here. It only enables when there are exactly 2 atoms selected and they aren't bonded together. So next in line is set element. And like most of these operations, set element works on multiple selection. And the default is naturally carbon. So I can just change both of these atoms to carbon with 1 click. If I wanted to change them to nitrogen, I would click the arrow to open this little palette. Then I would click nitrogen, or I could set them back to oxygen. The last used element always appears here, so if you missed one when you were trying to select it or you realize you want to change more, you can just click this button and it will apply the last used element. And I should, of course, note that we have more than these 8 elements. You can pick from the entire periodic table. And if you pick something from the periodic table, it will appear here. The last 2 that you used from the periodic table that aren't already here will appear on the palette so that you don't have to keep finding them again. So before the next buttons I'm going to skip because they are bond related. I'm going to jump right ahead to the charges, which again are pretty self-explanatory. If you increment the charge, you can just select an atom and increment the charge. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a little +1 here to let you know that it succeeded. And if you mouse over it, if you look down here at the status bar, when I mouse over the atom, you'll see the +1 charge there. You can then obviously decrement the charge, and that takes care of the basics for atoms. We'll now show you the bond. Here's a good example of a bond. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you've noticed, but I can now select a bond just by clicking in the middle between 2 atoms when I'm in atom picking mode. So atom picking mode is now atom and bond picking mode. You just pick between the 2. And if you don't remember that, you can always still pick 2 atoms and those will represent the bond as well. So now I can increment the bond order and I can do this until I get to 3, and then I can go down. I can actually go down to 0, so on. I can, again, as with most of this functionality, I can do this on multiple selections, so I could have selected more than 1 bond and taken the action simultaneously. And they don't have to be the same bond order to start with. Okay. So those are most of the basic edits. The 2 other buttons that I consider pretty basic are these 2. Adding hydrogens is useful if you've either been given a structure and you don't know whether it has all its hydrogens, or you get an error when you try to minimize. That may be because there aren't sufficient hydrogens, and this will fill in any missing hydrogens. So just to give you an example, I will delete a few. And by the way, the delete key on your keyboard will tend to work to do delete atoms, unless you're on a Mac. I believe that it won't work because it's not really delete. So anyway, if I select my structure now and click add hydrogens, I get those hydrogens back, and any others that I might have accidentally deleted, including this one up here. And you can do it selectively, so if you'd only wanted to add hydrogens back in one spot for some reason, you can just select that atom and do that. Now minimize is also operates on selection. So if I want to just minimize the portion of the atom that I've been messing around, the portion of the molecule that I've been messing around with, I can select those atoms and click minimize. I don't know if you saw it kind of wiggled. It's a little hard to see sometimes when it's mostly minimized. There we go. I can, of course, select the entire structure and minimize it, but in the absence of a protein, it may not do exactly what you wanted. If it's docked, it will take into account the protein when it does it. Control M is the keyboard shortcut for minimization. I should note that if you have a selection, Control M will minimize the selected atoms, but if you don't have a selection, it will minimize all atoms. So you want to be careful with that. So we're down to the last row, and If we have lots of extra time when I'm done, we can certainly go back and talk more about details. But the last row has the Draw Structure button, which is currently disabled in 16.2 because it wasn't quite ready. It'll be available in 16.3, and we'll talk about it then. Move Atoms is where we put all the movement actions that we have, everything that you might have previously known as transform, sculpt, and adjust, are all available here. And to give you an example of a common enough use case, I guess, some people like to do docking by eyeball, kind of, rough docking by themselves. Of course, this is already docked, but suppose it wasn't. Suppose you wanted to just move this ligand into the pocket. You could go select the ligand and go into Move Atoms. And now with your right mouse key, you can translate the structure, and with your middle mouse key or whatever you use for rotation, you can rotate the structure. And I'm just going to cancel out of this because I don't want to mess up my structure. And one thing to note is that when you are in Move Atoms, you can't, because your regular mouse keys are linked to moving selected atoms, you can't move the camera view. Right now I have nothing selected and I'm trying to move my camera and nothing's happening. So what you need to do if you want to move your camera while you're in Move Atoms is press spacebar and bring up what we call the heads-up display. And then when you use your left mouse, press and drag, you can rotate or translate or zoom. So remember that whenever you're in Move Atoms and you want to move the camera, press spacebar and use this tool. So in here, I want to show you that in addition to moving entire structures and using Move Atoms, you can move parts of structures. And basically, Move Atoms will only move the atoms that you have selected. So I'm dragging this with my right mouse key, and I'm rotating this with my right mouse key. And if I had actually failed to select one of these atoms, I'd be doing this. And as you can see, I can change my selection as I go. I can work with this and then work over here and so on. And I'm still in Move Atoms mode. So that's one set of actions. Those are the most common set of actions perhaps that you can do while you're in Move Atoms. There's another feature that we used to call Sculpt. And the idea there is if you have a single atom and you want to drag it and then minimize around that movement that you did, you can do that with your left mouse button. So select the one atom, press with your left mouse and drag, and when you let go, it will be minimized, the structure will be minimized around that. So as you see, I was able to flip this structure and get it into a new minimum in one movement like that. And this is useful both for, quickly changing the conformer and for also getting out of a local minimum into maybe a different one. If you didn't want it to auto-minimize, you could just select the one atom and use your right mouse. It's not very interesting. Okay, and then the final feature of Move Atoms is that we have quick adjustments, which means that basically as you're selecting atoms, if you select the right sort of atoms, you will be allowed to adjust them quickly. So in this case, by default, the adjustment is the dihedral rotations. So if you select a dihedral bond, you're prompted that you can now rotate with your left mouse along that dihedral. And anytime you select a dihedral bond, you can do this. If you didn't mean to rotate it, you can go ahead and pick other atoms and it'll go away. So I can pick more atoms. Sorry, there we go. And now, the dihedral rotation goes away. But as long as I have exactly the one dihedral selected, it offers me the dihedral action. And I can actually even, drag these if I wanted. But if I use my left mouse, I'll be doing a rotation. And the rotation is generally in the direction of the smaller substituent by default. But if you see there's a green arrow, and if I click that green arrow, it actually reverses which substituent is being rotated. So this quick adjust, like I said, it defaults to dihedral rotation, and notice it gives you the prompt that you have to select a bond. If you change it to, for instance, length and distances, now the adjustment on the bond is assumed to be a bond length adjustment, and when you drag with your left mouse, you're doing a length adjustment. And again, you can change the direction of the adjustment. And in this case, notice it says select bond or two atoms because it is also for distance. Again, this is more likely to be used if you're trying to adjust the distance between two molecules. But just to show you, you can actually adjust the distance between any two atoms. The third most frequently used option is angles. You can quickly adjust angles here by either selecting two bonds. Remember to use Shift-click to select the two. And now you're in angle adjustment mode. And if you selected three bonds, let me do this right, it would give you the dihedral rotation, the dihedral adjustment, excuse me. So, and again, I've been using bonds because it's faster, but if you wanted to pick individual atoms instead, just remember, Shift-click along your atoms, and you can adjust. When you're done working in this space, when you're done moving atoms, you can either cancel or say OK. Now, obviously, OK is going to keep all your changes, and that's probably what you want to do most of the time. But suppose you came in here and you started doing something, and you decided that, oh no, I'm messing it up. I dragged this in a really wonky way, and I didn't mean to drag it like that. And oh my goodness, you can just go cancel. And when it closes, it will restore it to the last state it was before you started the last set of changes. It won't necessarily undo, it won't undo all the changes you made, but it will undo the last set of changes you made that are all of the same type, using the same atom. Okay, so that's move atoms. Now, some people might remember that we used to have adjustments without having to go into move atoms mode, and we still have those. We have a menu here next to move atoms called the adjust only menu, and that lets you, for instance, rotate dihedrals without having to worry about your camera view, because now I'm in this mode, but I can still use my regular right mouse and middle mouse actions to move my camera view. And as you can see, I already had selected this on, so as soon as I went into rotate dihedral mode, it said, oh, you want to rotate that bond? Okay. But you can change which bond you're rotating. So in other respects, it acts just like the quick adjustment in move atoms, and the only difference really is that you don't have to worry about your camera view. You can go ahead and use your regular camera view actions. If you did want to switch to move atoms because perhaps you find that you're switching between different adjustments or want to move some atoms, you can just click this link and go into move atoms mode. So as you can see, all the adjustments are available here. They were all available in the Move Atoms pane. All right, there was one little feature of the Move Atoms thing I wanted to show you. As you can see, all these adjustments are available, and there's also settings as to which atoms get moved when you're making the adjustment. Now, the default is to move all attached atoms naturally, but if you did want to limit the scope of the movement, you can do that here. Okay, so that's it for Move Atoms. And now we're going to add fragments, which of course is more useful when you're actually building. But I will show you, just to give you a quick preview, Add Fragments opens up a whole subpane that is toggleable. And in fact, it stays open. So if you close the builder and you open it again, you don't have to keep opening it if you find you're using it a lot. And on this pane, you have your rings, your common organic fragments, your common metal center fragments, and then you have a link to other, which brings up the full fragment library. when you're in either organic or metal centers, there's a More button that lets you quickly get to more fragments of that type. And if you pick from this palette, it will fill in these 4 slots here on the palette, on the main palette. And so you don't have to keep going back to your favorite fragments. Now, as you notice, this is all enabled because I've actually selected an atom. If I hadn't selected anything, that would all be disabled, because we again are enforcing a select first paradigm. So if you have to select a bond or an atom to add a fragment, except in the case where you're working in a completely new structure, because obviously you have to start somewhere. So when you have absolutely nothing in the workspace, you can just add a fragment. And as you can see, when you add a fragment, you get this little floating icon, which is what I call the new fragment menu. And it gives you actions that you can take on the new fragment. In this case, there's not a lot you can do. Obviously, delete is useful, but there's not much you can do. But I'll show you some examples where that's more useful. So here I'm going to select 2 bonds, and I'm going to add the same fragment to both of them simultaneously. And they each get their new fragment menu. When I look in it, I see that I have a choice of flipping the orientation. So it just flipped. Or I can actually change the connection side. Since this is an asymmetric fragment, I might have wanted to connect it in a different way. And again, as I'm changing connection side, I can also flip the orientation. So this will stay available until you either hit enter or escape, which resets it back to the way it was. Reset is also available in the menu here under reset fragment. And you can also just, once you've picked the side you want it to be connected at, you can just go ahead and do something else and it'll go away by itself. So, and as you'll notice, that menu only changed the one fragment. Each fragment's menu is particular to that fragment, so it lets you change things independently. So again, I can change however I like. On this side, I think I'll make them symmetric because it's more attractive. And I think that looks about right. And now if I'm happy, I can either check this or press enter. So that's one use of the fragment menu, and it's a new feature that we didn't have before. And there's a similar option available if you add an atom. You can add a structure that's asymmetric, and you may want to change the orientation in one sense, again, because there's 2 hydrogen directions here, and so you can pick which one you want it to align with. You can also change the connection point. But in this case, because there are multiple hydrogens, there are actually, in some sense, 2 connection points or 2 orientations at each connection point, and you can either choose the default or pick a different one. So I'm going to stay with that. And once again, I can hit enter on the keyboard, and I'm out of that, but I can always go back into it. And this particular fragment, because it's connected by a dihedral bond, I can actually access rotate dihedral through this menu as well. So if I want to, and again, I use my left mouse when I'm in rotate dihedral mode and say I'm fine with that, and I say OK. Now from this point, you know, this is a silly structure, but from this point I have this bond selected. I could actually increase the bond order. I can select atoms and, you know, change the element and so forth, and basically build away. So I think I'm going to stop here and start taking